Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Langlois, and I am the Vice President of the Cape Fear Civil War Roundtable here in Wilmington, North Carolina. Today, we have a really special treat. We're going to be exploring the Battle of Hatcher's Run. Perhaps you're not as familiar with that battle as some of the other battles from the Civil War that are much more well known. And if you don't know as much about it, hopefully we're going to remedy that today for you. I'm joined today by Dr. Nigel Lambert from across the Atlantic in the UK, who's invested quite a bit of time and effort, research, and written extensively specifically on the Battle of Hatcher's Run. So he's going to share some of that with us today. So without wasting any more time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lambert to share some of his knowledge and passion on the Battle of Hatcher's Run. Dr. Lambert, thank you for joining us.
Right, thank you, Chris, and thank you for inviting me to your roundtable to discuss the Battle of Hatcher's Run, February the 5th to the 7th, 1865. And it's a real honor and a privilege for me to be here with you to talk about the battle. And with all the battle's connections to North Carolina, it seems a very fitting place to be with you in Cape Fear. I usually label my talks as Grant's 8th Petersburg Offensive, which is mainly because folks have heard of Grant and have heard of Petersburg, but the eyes of any even knowledgeable audiences can tend to glaze over when I say I'm going to talk about the Battle of Hatcher's Run. It's fair to say that posterity hasn't treated the battle particularly kindly, and I think we'll further discuss that later on. That's an important part of the story.
Specifically on that, how did you become interested not only in the American Civil War but the Hatcher's Run specifically?
Right. Okay. So I'll put a bit of context into that question that I get asked quite a lot about. So yeah, briefly a little bit about me. So I'm a retired UK scientist. So that's obviously something of a quantum leap from UK scientist to recognised authority on Hatcher's Run, which is a fairly obscure Civil War battle. And yeah, I could take up half of our time joining up those dots, but I think with your permission, I'll lightly sidestep that rabbit hole, as my main aim is mainly to raise the awareness of the battle. However, I do need to summarize a couple of important aspects alluding to your question, because people might be thinking, so watching this, well, what's a UK scientist got anything to say useful about the American Civil War? So, and that's a pretty, I think that's a very legitimate question. And I think everybody should ask any author or presenter, what are their credentials? So I've got a 40-year career in both quantitative and qualitative research. So I've published over 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles. So basically, I'm no stranger to research and analysis. So I've been an armchair Civil War enthusiast since the 1960s, and I've been lucky enough to visit many of the battlefields on numerous occasions. Sadly, I've never made it to North Carolina. So regarding my Hatcher's Run work, I've been blessed to collaborate with many US historians and experts. My free ebook is the most extensive text on the battle to date. And that explains more about who I am, where I've come from, and the philosophical framework I've used to create the narrative. I will single out Petersburg doyen Bruce Sudereau, who's been a constant companion with me throughout the journey. And you may know that Bryce co-wrote with Ed Bierce in 2014 a 2-volume award-winning book on the Petersburg Campaign. So hopefully that's to those watching has alluded any fears as to what my credentials are. So now how I stumbled across Hatcher's Run, again, that's a pretty long story, but I'll cut that short. So I stumbled across Hatcher's Run in 2020 when I had a local friend who we've been on the battlefields with many times. He acquired a Union rifle, and with all the paperwork and markings on it, in all probability, it was that it was captured by Confederates at the Hatcher's Run battle. So I was keen to know more about the battle, and I was absolutely shocked and dumbfounded to discover there was no book about the battle. And I saw this as a substantial 3-day battle between A-list protagonists Grant and Lee in the prime sector of Petersburg, and there was no dedicated book. So I thought that was rather strange. And then what I did find that had been written about the battle was contradictory and confused. So it all seemed a bit weird. And the more I explored, the more I discovered how fascinating the battle was. And thus I got more intrigued as to why it had been neglected. Basically, from that acorn of curiosity, a substantial tree has grown. So I now run the popular Hatcher's Run Facebook group, and I cross-post fairly frequently on your roundtables page.
I think it's very interesting too to me. It's almost a historian's dream to find an aspect like this, a battle that is very significant and large, but hasn't really been covered by anyone else. So that sounds like it was a gold mine of interest for you.
I was just completely shocked and stunned, really. So I went on the internet to buy a book from, I won't say where, but you can guess, and there just wasn't one. So I was just, because I mean, there's books written about virtually every aspect of the Civil War, and every obscure engagement and skirmish seems to have some book written about it. So I've got quite a library of books and things here. But so there it was, a big eye opener and a shock.
So speaking of that, why don't we get into the battle and tell us a little bit about what you know, summarizing the battle, and then I think later on we'll get into the significance and the aftermath as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, for that, Chris. I mean, a blow-by-blow account of this roller coaster 3-day battle would literally take hours to go through. And then I'd still have to describe the consequences and legacy of the battle as well. So I'm just giving a fairly brief overview here, about 15 or 20 minutes. My main aim is to entice people to access my free ebook, and then they'll get to learn the full story. So battles never occur in a vacuum, and I'm largely going to skip over the context of the February 1865 Hatcher's Run battle. The Petersburg Campaign had been going on since June 1864, and it would become the longest campaign of the war. And the Hatcher's Run battle arose out of Grant's 8th Petersburg offensive. So on February the 3rd, 1865, the failed peace conference on the River Queen steamship moored in Hampton Roads took place. As I said, that not unsurprisingly didn't amount to anything much. But around noon on the very next day, February the 4th, Grant proposed a large cavalry raid on Belfield, about 40 miles south of Petersburg, to disrupt a large rebel supply base. So if you can put up map 1, Chris, that should give some context. Right. Here we go. Yeah, so here's a simple scheme of Belfield's down at the bottom here. So this was his main attack. Petersburg's obviously here. Further to the north, and further to the north of that is Richmond, and the red arrows are the supply route. So Grant's aim was a cavalry raid to Belfield and destroy and disrupt the rebel supply base there. So now, however, Army of Potomac Commander George Meade wisely persuaded Grant to change his plan. And indeed, this offensive I think, is a neat case study in the relationship between Grant and Meade. And the mission finalized only late on February the 4th was a cavalry raid for the following morning. So it was quite a rushed affair, really. It was starting just a few hours later. And what they decided was they were going to disrupt the supply route at Dinwiddie Courthouse, which is the other yellow star here, which is on the Boyd and Plank Road. That's only 10-15 miles southwest of the Union lines. And the 5th Infantry Corps and most of the 2nd Infantry Corps were ordered to support this cavalry raid. Now, surprisingly, despite ample evidence, the genesis of this offensive is commonly misrepresented, and we'll probably touch on that later because that feeds into the narrative of the whole battle. And so I wrote an emerging Civil War article covering the genesis of this battle and what really the aims and objectives of this offensive was. So if we look to map 2 now, Chris. So this shows the plan that was agreed in more detail and gives people a sense of the basic geography that we're talking about here. So early on February the 5th, at 3 in the morning, actually, David Gregg's cavalry division, which is here in orange, set off from their camps along the Jerusalem Plank Road towards Dinwiddie Courthouse, which is the green dot on the left. So to disrupt the Confederate supply line. So they managed to get to Dinwiddie Courthouse but just after noon. The roads were pretty terrible, really. It's in the middle of winter here. So they arrived at Dinwiddie Courthouse, and to their great surprise, they discovered that the supply route had been largely abandoned. And the whole offensive, which had been endangering about 30,000 Union soldiers, had in effect been a wild goose chase. So the cavalry headed back to safety, and the mission, as envisaged, was technically over.
Well, one question about that I wanted to bring up that kind of ties into the Cape Fear area. It was very interesting to me. So the supply line that was coming from Wilmington, from the port of Wilmington, which was the main last port that was open, was fairly significant. In fact, we know that Robert E. Lee's quote of "If Wilmington falls, I cannot sustain my army."
Yeah.
Wilmington was pretty significant. So that supply route coming up the Weldon Railroad, and although the Union had cut the Weldon Railroad just south of Petersburg, they were actually unloading the trains, taking them by wagon over to Dinwiddie Courthouse and up the Boynton Plank Road.
Yeah.
However, as you said, when General Gregg arrived, that supply line had pretty much been abandoned.
Yeah.
Do you think it had been abandoned because of the fall of Fort Fisher, which had fallen back in January 15th and been captured by Union forces?
That would be my guess. I've got no evidence to support that, but that would be my assumption. We have no information of what the intelligence was that Grant was working towards, if indeed he did have any, for that matter. So yeah, we don't know, but I think obviously the capture of Fort Fisher and then the effective closure of Wilmington was a sort of major issue, and that's bound to have impacted on the supply basis. So, I think the point you make about General Lee's desire to preserve Wilmington is very important. But I was at we had a reciprocal thing. We had a guy from Bentonville in your state who came and who did a Zoom talk for our London roundtable, and he made the point that Lee considered Wilmington more important than Richmond from a military point of view. And another interesting aspect of that is that I've been working with John Horn and Bryce Sudero on a fairly mysterious and unknown action taken by General Mahone's division, for all his division. They were ordered out in the middle of January, and they only got back late January, and they got sent to North Carolina. And we've got John Horn found evidence of the troops doing a movement there, but they didn't get involved in any fighting or such. But the nature and motives of that maneuver, we haven't been able to actually track down, and it's something that's not known about. But to send effectively your best division from the trenches in Petersburg to go to North Carolina tends to suggest something. Perhaps he was wanting to use Mahone to kind of defend Fort Fisher. So there are lots of uncertainties and unknown things there, but it's certainly there's lots of stuff going on there, and I think that's an important aspect of the why the supply line had effectively ceased to exist to any intents and purposes.
Well, once General Gregg got there and made that discovery, how did we get into a 3-day battle after that point?
Yes, and Gregg bizarrely handed his notice in 3 days before he was given this mission. So that's another interesting side story as well. As I wrote an article about that too. So yes, warfare tends to take on a course of its own. During the morning, during that same morning, Warren with his Fifth Corps, which are here shown in the blue, on their way to the western end of Vaughan Road, they'd had to cross Monk's Neck's Bridge, and they'd had a bit of a significant skirmish there, which has got lots of text coverage. There was quite a significant dust up there, and lots of dramatic tales of soldiers having to swim the partially frozen Rowanty Creek to capture the crossing. So that's what he was doing during the morning. Also, General Humphreys with most of the Second Corps is here listed in purple. They, along with Warren, set off at 7 o'clock, and they captured 2 important crossings of Hatcher's Run, which is seen there with the yellow combat icons, one at Armstrong's Mill and one at the Vaughan Road crossing. So they managed to capture those with relatively ease. In fact, it seemed that the Confederates had been caught napping. Maybe that they weren't expecting a Union advance in the middle of winter, and this was the only battle ever fought in Virginia in a February, for instance. And perhaps they weren't expecting one so close to the peace conference. So they were caught napping, really. And I think Lee probably feared this was a repeat of the 6th Petersburg offensive, which had tried to turn the rebel right flank, and get into the South Side Railroad. So Lee decided that something needed to be done here because he wasn't too sure what was going on. So what Lee did was, and you can see the red icons and the main Confederate defences protecting the Boyd and Plank Road leading into Petersburg, which is just off the map to the north. So Lee ordered an attack on Humphreys' line, the purple line, which had formed a line the other side of Rocky Branch, just north and east of Armstrong's Mill. They were only about 1,000 yards away from the main rebel works, the red icons there. And so what happened was at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the first of 3 rebel attacks occurred, and all of which the Federals repelled before nightfall ended the fighting. And I've done much to clarify the details of this particular action. So both who took place and why the attacks failed, because that's been surrounded in confusion. So, and it's claimed that Lee wept like a child at the performance of his troops during this action. Now, despite winning a resounding victory, either side of Rocky Branch, both Meade and Grant were concerned at the scale of the Confederates' attack and realized that they'd actually had quite a lucky escape. And they feared a further assault in the morning. So overnight, the Federals consolidated their positions around Humphreys' fairly vulnerable position. So Warren's Fifth Corps was ordered back up the Vaughan Road towards Humphreys. Gregg's cavalry that were making their way back to Malone's Bridge, they were called back as well to get to Humphreys' position. And they also called for further reinforcements from the 6th Corps and the 9th Corps. So overnight, all these Union units all moved to Humphreys' position around Armstrong's Mill. And by morning, most of them were generally in place. So by which time Meade was breathing a lot easier. From the Confederate perspective, Lee considered that the fighting was over, and he started sending some of his troops back to Petersburg. And that could well have been the end of the battle there as well. However, 2 very curious decisions ensured that much blood would be spilt that afternoon. So if we look at map 3, we kind of zoom in to, here we go, yeah, so we're kind of zooming in around Armstrong's Mill and Dabney's Mill here. So this is the right end of the Confederate line. You can see the red crosses, and they sort of kind of end at the Crow House, which has got a redoubt there. So for reasons that are unknown, at around 10 o'clock on February the 6th, John Pegram, who's commanding the Confederate division guarding the Crow House, he decides to split his force, and he accompanies 2 of his brigades down Quaker Road, which is on the left edge of the map, and back up Vaughan Road, where they join some dismounted Confederate cavalry who have been skirmishing with Gregg's cavalry for most of the early morning. Now, this just left 1 brigade of his around the Crow House, and this 1 brigade was just left defending the entire right flank of the Confederate line. And the second strange thing that happened at around 12:30 that afternoon, just after noon, Union General Gouverneur Warren ordered David Gregg's cavalry to charge down Vaughan Road and clear what they thought was just a few dismounted rebel cavalry troopers. That's fair enough, but more perplexing, he also ordered two full infantry divisions, those of Crawford and Ayres, to advance on Dabney's Mill, which is here in the middle of effectively middle of a jungle, in front of the Crow House. So why would send?
It's very curious. What made you? What do you think caused? Because it didn't sound like Lee wanted to attack in the morning. What do you think caused Pegram to split his division in that way?
Well, that's one of the great unknowns and fascinations of the battle, really. Yeah, I think Lee had considered the affair over, and he was sending troops back to Petersburg for sure. And even more strangely is that we know that the night before, Pegram met General Gordon, who was his corps commander, and Gordon had told Pegram that he was expecting an attack, a Union attack on his front, around the Crow House in the following morning. So, given that he'd been told that, it seems a bit. I mean, I've never got any military background or training at all, but I have discussed this matter with sort of military-minded people, and they probably agree with me. It seems a bit odd if you're expecting an attack on your front, then you don't split your force and just leave one fairly small brigade, about 800 men, to protect, which is effectively quite an important aspect of the whole line there. If the Union get in through Crow House, past the redoubt, they're in behind the Confederate main works. They're on their way to Burgess Mill and then further on to the South Side Railroad, the capture of which would doom Petersburg and Richmond. So this was quite a significant decision. Whether he took it on his own back or whether General Gordon told him to split it, I'm not even too sure what he was aiming to do, really, with just two brigades. Maybe he was expecting to team up with the whole of Rooney Lee's cavalry, because they'd been sent for the previous day. Most of them didn't show up, so to the battle. So yeah, it's not quite sure what he's hoping to do, because he's only a couple of brigades and he's going to be facing the whole of the Union Fifth Corps. Not to mention you've got the Second Corps as well, not far behind. So difficult to know what his decision was or what his thinking was there. And similarly, not clear thinking why Warren would send two infantry corps off into the wilderness, effectively, with no previous reconnaissance. I don't quite know what that was about, really. So there's quite an interesting history to all that, because he should have he got sent orders to do a probe on his front earlier in the morning, just as the Second Corps, Humphreys, had done. So they just, a probe, that's what Humphreys did. He just sent a couple of regiments out just to see what the rebels were up to. And then if there were any outside of their works, they were to report back. And then he was going to send in a bigger force and push them all back to their works. He did that probe and there was all the Confederates were back in their works anyhow. So they'd wanted Warren to do the same, but the messages that he got were ambiguous, so he didn't actually do anything. So and then Meade turned up around noon, and they probably had quite an interesting conversation. Two fairly fiery kind of characters, weren't on very good terms by that stage of the war anyhow. So so what they come up with this meeting was, rather than just send a couple of regiments up Dabney's Mill Road to Dabney's Mill just to see what the Confederates were up to, they go in effectively as a reconnaissance in force. We send two full infantry divisions, and they know what the terrain's like because Crawford got hopelessly lost in exactly the same place in October in the Battle of Burgess Mill, which was fought over similar terrain. So it's not as though they didn't know what the terrain was like. So it just seems, again, somewhat bizarre that you just send two infantry divisions into the jungle. So, but that's what happened, and that those two actions ensured that there was going to be severe fighting at the two locations, one on the Vaughan Road and one around Dabney's Mill, and they're separated by about a mile of fairly inhospitable wilderness terrain, sort of thick forest, swamps, and ravines. It's very cold, icy weather. So, I mean, actually getting about in that terrain is a challenge. So I'll talk you through what happened at both of those venues. I'll start with the Vaughan Road action first. And as ordered, David Gregg's cavalry charged down Vaughan Road, expecting to push back the dismounted Confederate cavalry with some ease. But then, surprise to them, they crashed headlong into Pegram's two infantry brigades. And quite unsurprisingly, the Union cavalry predictably got badly mauled. And it was only at the help of a nearby Federal infantry brigade that came to their aid, and for a while managed to contain Pegram's jubilant rebels. At about 3 o'clock, with Federal ammunition running low, another Union infantry brigade, that of Horatio Sickles, went to their aid, and Sickles' men managed to scatter Pegram's force into the nearby woods. And at around 3:30, Pegram regrouped his men, and they headed north through the inhospitable terrain towards the sound of battle at Dabney's Mill, and to reunite with their lone brigade that they'd left earlier in the morning. So while all this fighting had been going on along the Vaughan Road, if we rewind the clock back to about 1:30, and we've got Warren accompanying 5 Union brigades marching towards Dabney's Mill, and guarded by the sole Confederate brigade. It's actually a Tar Heel brigade commanded at the time by Colonel John Gimlett Lee, who was guarding the Confederate right. And as I mentioned before, that a Union breakthrough here would be a complete catastrophe for the Confederates, and could actually, in theory, end the war if they broke through there and got to the South Side Railroad. Now, unfortunately for Warren, the muddy, icy forest trail was very narrow that he was going on, and he couldn't get all his force to the front to overwhelm the solitary rebel brigade, who I must say fought quite tenaciously as well. And the terrain and the tenacity of the Tar Heel soldiers bought the Confederates some time to order up reinforcements. And it was during this initial Union advance, which involved Bragg's and Baxter's brigades, that Sally, the famed 11th Pennsylvania mascot dog, was killed by Lee's troops. So here we have the memorial to the famous dog. This is that part of the 11th Pennsylvania Monument at Gettysburg. There have been 3 books written about Sally, and she has her own Wikipedia page. So less well known are the two handlers who perished with her at the same time, but I've managed to track down um, their probable names. And it's also less well known that Sally wasn't the only dog killed at the battle, but certainly in terms of recognition and people's awareness, sort of everybody seems to know about Sally the dog. They sort of know more about that's about the one thing that most people know about the Battle of Hatcher's Run.
Sally sounds like she had more books written about her than the battle has written
That's
about.
right. That's amazing, isn't it? Really, yes.
Was it pretty common for units to have dogs, for instance, as a mascot along with them?
It was, yes. I did a recent Facebook post about mascots in the Civil War, and there was all sorts of animals. We've got, there's an eagle and squirrels, and people had possums and things. But certainly dogs was the most popular, um, and they brought a lot of comfort and support to the troops. So certainly Sally's got a very interesting backstory. I mean, she was given to the regiment as a puppy at the start of the war and was with them throughout, all their battles, all the way up to Hatcher's Run. So yeah, so she's much beloved pet. So whether they were pets or official mascots is somewhat debatable, and quite where you draw the line, I don't know. But certainly, Sally has become incredibly famous. In fact, I've been told by the rangers at Gettysburg they get a bit annoyed because every day they've got to go to the monument and clean off all the bones and things that visitors leave on the memorial
Yes.
for her. So yeah, so that's Sally. So yeah, so if we go back to the map, that's right, right. So just after 2 o'clock, Clement Evans' division arrives from the Confederate left, which is um, some of the troops in the main rebel lines. So they managed to get there and help to support Lee. That's Gimlet Lee in holding off the Warren's Union advances. And there's some fierce fighting occurs around the mill, Dabney's Mill, and the possession of the site switches hands several times. It's a back of to and fro and charge and counter charge. Now, there was little that was left of Dabney's Mill by February 1865. And what combatants remember most was that a huge sawdust pile, which provided a focus for the fighting, because we were in the middle of dense woods. Here we are. So in a clearing, the mill had been in a clearing. All what was left was a sawdust pile. This is just to give you people some idea of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a pile of sawdust in a 19th century steam sawmill. This obviously isn't the sawmill at Dabney's Mill, but you get an idea. These are people on the top of here of the size and scale of the thing. So it was quite a prominent feature. In fact, some Union soldiers thought it was a Confederate fort. Such was the scale of the sawdust pile. So yeah, so a lot of back and forth fighting to gain possession of this pile of sawdust, basically. So if we go back to the map again, there we go. So around 4:30, where we had the arrival of yet another federal brigade got thrown into the mix, and the Union launched a severe attack on the right of the Confederate line. Now, at this self same time, following their march from Vaughan Road, who would arrive at exactly that moment was Pegram and his two infantry brigades. So they just arrived on the Confederate right just when the Union was launching an attack. Now, in the initial hail of Federal bullets, Pegram was killed outright, and a brigade commander was seriously wounded. However, with the extra two infantry brigades that had arrived, the rebels easily repelled the Federal attack. And around 5 o'clock, a noticeable lull came over the battlefield. The two sides had been fighting here for over 3 hours in terrible conditions. So the Federals retreated about 200 yards southeast of Dabney's Mill, and they started to dig in. The Confederates had got some serious reorganizing to do around Dabney's Mill. They'd lost a division commander, they'd lost a brigade commander, and a gap had appeared in the middle of their line. In fact, Tar Heel General William Lewis took over Pegram's divisional command at that instance. Now, John Pegram was the most senior officer killed at the battle, and there's a huge backstory here. I think we've got a picture. Oh, I can go back to the other picture as well. That's important. Yes. So this gives you some idea of the sort of conditions that these guys were fighting in. It's hardly ideal for military maneuvers.
It looks like a fairly dense area of woods that they're
That's
fighting.
it. That's absolutely right. That's what it was. And you throw in swamps and ravines, and the fact it's freezing cold, so there's a thin layer of ice over a lot of the surface water and what have you. And there's lots of tales of the Union troops moving up to the front, or Warren trying to get them up to the front. They put their foot in the soil, and it gets sucked in, and they lose their shoes. So they're virtually exhausted by the time they do get to the front, because it's such a hassle to get there. And there's lots of briars and other stuff, so it's kind of ripping their uniform to shreds. A lot of their muskets fail to work because they've all got water and gummed up bits of mud and stuff in them.
Another
So
interesting aspect of this battle is that it occurred in February during the winter, when you
that's
don't hear
right.
very many battles taking place. We're usually in winter quarters during that time.
That's right. So that had a massive influence on the battle for two reasons. One is a lot of officers go on leave during the winter. They've got to recuperate and recover and get recharged for the spring campaign. So a lot of senior officers were missing here. So there's a lot of experienced officers missing from this battle, which would have had a bearing. And that's all the way from senior brigade commanders down to regimental and company commanders. So a lot of experience is missing, and also, as you say, and as this, I mean, there's a very good reason why this is the only battle ever fought in Virginia in a February. I mean, it's just not a good time to be launching offensive, because the roads with the the Virginia soil, it just gets so boggy and muddy. It just doesn't enable easy troop movement on any large scale. So that's very much on Grant, really, because this was obviously his first winter in Virginia. So I think Meade all along was fairly skeptical about the whole venture, really. But yes, it certainly had a big bearing, and with more to come, as I'll get to. So yes, so if we move on to Pegram, the next here we go. So so I suppose after Sally the dog, the death of Pegram's about the next best known thing about the battle. and that's mainly not because he was a particularly great strategic commander, Pegram, but he was very popular and charismatic within Richmond society. And only 3 weeks earlier, the poor bloke had married again another famous person, the famous Southern belle Hetty Carey, in a very lavish, probably one of the most the I suppose the last sumptuous thing that the Confederacy actually did, I suppose, was this big wedding. So they were very popular in Richmond society. In fact, Pegram was born in Petersburg. He died less than 10 miles from where he was born. So he's very much a local lad. So, yeah, so big backstory there, which I don't really have time to go into, but I think it's important to mention. So if we go back to the map again, so soon after 5 o'clock, here we go. Yeah, so we've had this lull. The Union are digging in. They're getting reinforcements, hopefully coming up from the south. The Confederates in a bit of disarray from an organizational point of view, but fortunately for them, around 5 o'clock, just after 5 o'clock, Confederate Brigadier General Joe Finnegan arrived with Mahone's division, William Mahone being absent ill. They'd been some of the troops that had been sent back to Petersburg earlier in the day by Lee, but then when all this happened, Lee quickly sent a courier to tell them to turn back and get back to the Crow house ASAP. So they eventually arrived, and Finnegan spearheaded an assault on the Union line. And the Union line first buckled and then broke, and the Federals fled to the rear in a wild stampede, chased by the jubilant rebels, with only nightfall and the sanctuary of nearby newly created earthworks that saved Warren's force from further humiliation. And the story behind this skedaddle is another central aspect to the entire battle. For many of the Union soldiers, this was their first battle, their first taste of combat. Large numbers of them hadn't even actually fired a rifle before. Many panicked, and we've got inexperienced officers in many cases because the chief officers were on leave. They started firing into their own men. Chain of command in that environment was problematic. The ammunition supplies had got stuck in the mud going up the narrow Dabney Mill Road. That got stuck. So a lot of the troops on the front didn't have much ammunition. And I think, as one soldier said, well, we're not going to stand here with empty muskets. So there was a massive skedaddle back to Sanctuary.
It sounds like as they were retreating, also there was an issue with some friendly fire from troops who were in the Union defenses that they were retreating back towards.
That's true. So lots of examples of friendly fire before that happened. But yes, as they approached their own defenses, trying to seek sanctuary. These are the defenses along Hatcher's Run. These that are in these V's here. So now you've got to put yourself in the shoes of these soldiers here. They're forming a line, and it's fairly dark by this time, 6-ish o'clock, and it gets dark about that time. Plus the fact you've got all the smoke and the trees adding to the darkness. So, and out of this darkness comes charging lots of soldiers. So, and if you could make out they had blue uniforms on, well, you'd be doing well. But then that didn't really help you very much, because a lot of the Confederates were wearing blue coats because all their coats had been threadbare, or they didn't have any, so they'd taken them off the dead or stolen them from the Union soldiers. So if you're there and there's a lot of people charging at you, then you don't know whether they're friend or foe, then it's not surprising that some are going to shoot first and ask questions later. So, and yes, some of them just ran away in panic when they saw these soldiers arriving. Others stood firm, and others, just fired a couple of volleys into them. And there was lots of accusations of who fired into who and who got blamed for all this. So that's an interesting story in its own right. I think I wrote an emerging Civil War article about that very issue. So, but yes, it certainly. I mean, one senior Union officer said it was the Fifth Corps' worst performance of the war, and Meade himself, the day after, called the event a disaster, quote unquote. So that's just how
Sounds
bad
like the
and
next
humiliating it was.
exactly. I think that was also a big aspect, especially of the next day on February 7th. Not only of the winter storm that occurred, but also it sounds like trying to regain some of that lost honor from the day before.
I think that's very right. I think that's spot on. Yes. So when the morning of February the 7th arrived, we've had overnight there'd been a terrible winter storm, snow, hail, heavy winds, and these troops had got no protection with them, especially those who were out on the front, because this was, still an active battlefield. So they got no tents. Most of them didn't have coats or gum blankets or anything. So they're just wet and frozen. And a lot of those wounded left on the battlefield quite simply froze to death. So, yeah, lots of stories about that gruesome night. So, in the morning, there was yet another winter storm, and there didn't seem to be a lot of appetite for further fighting. However, Warren, and as you correctly pointed out, probably keen to make amends for the humiliation that he'd suffered the previous evening, suggested, well, we could push back the strong Confederate picket line. So the Confederates overnight had put a strong picket line out over the ground that they'd captured. Warren suggested, well, we could push that back to their main works, which they'd now strengthened at Dabney's Mill. So now, despite concerns over troop morale that both Meade and Grant had, they reluctantly agreed to this action. And Warren ordered Crawford's division back out onto the same battlefield where they'd been humiliated the day before. And through, intermittently fierce, but sort of an ongoing fighting through, pretty grim weather, the Crawford's men slowly pushed back the Confederate pickets, and they pushed them back all the way to their main defences at Dabney's Mill. And they managed to do that by about 5 o'clock. And during this fighting, for instance, Confederate General Moxley Sorrell was severely wounded in that fight. And this was also during that fighting that the dog from the 7th Wisconsin regiment also suffered the same fate as Sally, and a lot of his regiment stopped and buried the dog there and then. So by 5 o'clock, they'd pushed them back to Dabney's Mill. Meade was very happy with this, but they called Warren back, say, well, you've done that now, come back to the trenches, and that'll be the end of it. So now we have a very mysterious situation that I also wrote about that also gets covered up, because at 6 o'clock, and this is quite getting quite dark by then, but at 6 o'clock, Crawford orders to attack the Confederate position at Dabney's Mill. Now they've strengthened this. They've got two divisions of men and they've got artillery there. The Union have got no artillery here. So it really is a suicide mission. So now, whether Warren ordered Crawford to do this attack or whether Crawford did this on his own bat, we don't know, and I'd be keen to know more details about that. So, but attack they did, and predictably they got completely mashed up. And twice they attacked before kind of common sense eventually prevailed, and the Union men retreated into the woods. And it wasn't until after midnight, 1 or 2 in the morning, the next day, again after another grueling night out uncovered on the battlefield, that Crawford's men got back to their defences, and with that, that brought an end to the Battle of Hatcher's Run.
Yeah, that was something interesting I took from your ebook was the orders from Meade to Warren. Meade actually told him that, yeah, you can go forward, or he wanted him to hold his position rather, unless great advantages will be gained, which sounds
That's
to me
right,
like
yeah.
a catch-22, because if there's a great advantage to be had, you don't go forward, then why didn't you? And if you
Mm.
go forward and it's a failure, why did you go forward? So it
Yeah.
sounds like Warren could have been in a little bit of a catch-22 there.
Yeah, yeah. So that is quite ambiguous. But both Meade and Grant were quite, I mean, they'd learnt by this stage in the war that they were very reluctant to attack defensive positions. And throughout the battle, the general message was send probes out or send reconnaissances out and attack forces that are outside of their defenses, but do not, under any circumstances, attack forces behind breastworks, because they know that they're not going to succeed and they're just going to lose a lot of men. Right, so that ended the Battle of Hatcher's Run. So, do you have any other queries
Yes.
about the battle itself?
Um, I think we covered a lot of the questions that I had. One of the things that I was also wondering about um, at the end there with Crawford's charge and how controversial it was, it sounds like Warren, as a Corps commander, never really reported or really admitted to Crawford's failed charges. Was Crawford one of Warren's favorite generals? Was he, I guess you could say, taking care of him to not highlight that failure?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting story. This so which there's lots of pieces missing. He does seem to be a favourite of Warren's, and certainly after the war they were quite good friends, and Crawford helped Warren with his travails over gaining his reputation after he got sacked at Five Forks, and that went on for years and years. All that story, but that's a separate story. So now about this, it's quite remarkable that Warren never actually admitted that this suicide attack ever took place. He said in one of his reports that the position was too strong, and that we didn't attack it, and we what he said was he just said that Crawford just pushed the Confederates back to Dabney's Mill, and he said that was that. So the irony, of course, of that is one of the few images of the battle taken at the time was a sketch for Harper's Weekly of this self-samed suicide attack on February the 7th. So, yeah, I haven't got it. I haven't got that image here, but yeah, that's um, in Harper's Weekly. So, it's quite bizarre that he could say that it didn't take place. And most of the regimental officers with Crawford, um, they wrote official reports, and all those mentioned them charging at 6 o'clock and getting badly beaten up. Now, one of the many curious aspects of this is that Crawford's official records, his battle report is missing. It's not in the official records, not in the supplements of the official records.
That's interesting.
It is, yes. So I haven't got my video on. There we go. There we go. So yeah, so where that is, I do not know. So I've been trying to locate that because he must have written a battle report, and given he was at the heart of most of the controversial decisions, it would certainly be very interesting to know what he had to say. I'm also trying to access Warren's personal records and letters and things that are stored in the New York State Library, but I haven't been able to access those. That's a bit tricky to get access to them, particularly when you're over at this side of the pond. So, but
Well,
yeah, they've got.
after 3 days of really significant fighting, what was really achieved? Who won this battle?
Yeah, so that's a classic question. It's customary to ask who won any given battle and what was accomplished. And in truth, most battles aren't that simplistic, and that's certainly true for the Hatcher's Run battle. In fact, most Civil War battles didn't land out a knockout blow. So, and at the time of the battle, Northern accounts reported how Grant had successfully extended his lines 4 miles further west. And in the South, reports showed how Lee had successfully repelled yet another Union offensive and given Grant's men a bloody nose. I
But
mean, both of those statements are
depends on who
absolutely
you
true.
ask.
Yeah. Now, success is often gauged on what the mission's objective was. That makes sense. Now, regarding Grant's eighth offensive, the stated and sole Union goal was to disrupt a substantial Confederate supply route. Now, given that that supply route no longer existed, then success is kind of rendered moot in that respect. And crucially, after 3 days of bloodletting, that reality and that aim isn't going to make for a good story to actually tell to politicians and the public. And this, to be fair to Meade, was something he'd been conscious of all along, because while they were planning this, Meade was saying, yeah, are you sure you really want to do this? And do you think the public and politicians are going to be happy with the outcome? Because they're going to want to see some sizable objective with all these troops being put at danger. And Grant was always assuring him, say, yeah, don't worry, it's going to, everything's going to be fine. It's going to, I've taken care of that, and I've alerted the politicians, and it is going to be a substantial, it's going to be a substantial achievement. And creating a favourable narrative is a vital task in warfare, and that's something that Grant had acquired a skill for by this stage of the war, whereas Meade unfortunately had an intense loathing of the press, and he'd severely punished a very favourite and popular correspondent, which obviously didn't do him a lot of favours with the press at all.
Although
yeah,
this
carry on, yeah.
battle occurred, I'm sorry. Although this battle occurred in February, and it was going to be a while before Lee eventually evacuated Petersburg and Richmond, do you think the Battle of Hatcher's Run, helped to convince Lee that the Union was eventually going to get around his right flank at some point in time, and that was going to be untenable if he continued to stay?
That's absolutely right. So soon after the battle, Lee changed his supply base to Amelia Courthouse, and he'd also lined up Burkeville as a place to unite his troops when the evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond, which he thought was an inevitability, was going to happen. So he started to build contingency plans for that very happening. He could see that. He did extend his lines further out along to the White Oak Road, for instance, but he knew he couldn't keep extending these lines. That there's always space for the Union to get around and behind him. So he was in fact doomed. So he was very much aware of that situation. I think the battle certainly crystallized that for him. It was probably something he was aware of.
You mentioned several times about how Hatcher's Run is neglected, a little bit misunderstood, and is not as well known as many other battles. My question would be, do you think the controversy behind the retreat, the Great Skedaddle, the friendly fire, Crawford's charges, and the need for Union commanders to seemingly kind of control the narrative on those things, do you think that contributed to this battle not being as well known?
Absolutely, that's for sure. So I think before I come to that, I'll just highlight a few things of. So that's really about why it was neglected. If I just highlight for people as to how it's been neglected, and then I'll circle back to what you've raised. So just briefly to recap, I haven't got into numbers here before, but this battle involved nearly 60,000 combatants. There was well over 2,500 casualties at a conservative estimate. 14 medals of honor were awarded, and it was the only battle fought in Virginia in February. Newspapers were full of the battle. One Georgia newspaper said it was one of the best fought battles of the war. Mm. And in the first books written about the war, the battle featured prominently. And there's lots of reports in the official records. But by 1880, the battle had either been ignored or trivialized with a distinct Union bias. Grant's memoirs don't mention the battle at all. Battles and Leaders, it's just a sentence in a wider footnote. So, and I've chronicled loads of examples of this. So if we fast forward to the 20th century, I'll just simply highlight 3 Pulitzer Prize examples. Douglas S. Freeman's Lee's Lieutenants from 1944 ignores the battle. Bruce Catton's 1953 Stillness at Appomattox, which as the title suggests specifically covers the final months of the war, has nothing at all to say about Hatcher's Run. And James M. McPherson's 1988 Battle Cry of Freedom, regarded by many as the best single volume account of the war, also doesn't mention Hatcher's Run. In Freeman Cleave's 1960 biography of Meade, he says, and I quote, "The battle finds no conspicuous place in the chronicles of the war." And how right he was. So more recently, there's been Hatcher's Run sections and chapters in books covering the whole of the Petersburg Campaign. Although written by esteemed historians, they're only summary accounts, and they contain many errors and contradictions that Bryce Sudereau and I addressed in a magazine article. So it's quite clear how the battle's been neglected, and I've got loads of examples of that. So now the issue is why it's been like that. Well, the human societies create narratives, and that's what binds them together. And historiography is the discipline of studying how histories are created. And academics have identified factors that influence, what does and doesn't get remembered or told in textbooks. And if I pick some of these examples out and apply that to Hatcher's Run, so the first one is reputational management. So we've got powerful voices like Grant, who, let's not forget, became president, and senior Union of generals. They were only too happy to forget about this battle and bury all their significant failings. How they'd endangered thousands of soldiers on a pointless mission, deploying vast numbers of inadequately trained troops, the humiliating skedaddle, as you'd mentioned, firing into their own men, the suicide assault on day 3. A senior officer actually accused Grant of hiding the truth from the public. And from a regimental perspective, common Federal soldiers in famed outfits hid the truth of the great skedaddle. One soldier from the 20th Maine, the famed 20th Maine, was brave enough to actually admit to this cover-up. From the Confederate perspective, well, they start at a disadvantage because they're usually the winners of wars that framed them. But Lee and many of his senior commanders, General Finnegan notwithstanding, but he never wrote a memoir afterwards, they'd no great incentive to recall the battle anyhow. Mass desertions, poor conditions, troops disobeying orders. So, there was no great incentive to perpetuate this battle. And by the 1890s, a sanitized Union version of the battle had been established, and attention went elsewhere. The mud and blood of Petersburg never really captured the public imagination, like Sherman's daring raids, Antietam, Shiloh, and such like. In such a way, there's many movies about World War II, but there's very few about World War One, with all that mud and blood.
Well, I'm glad that we have you to bring this battle, I guess you could say, back to life. It sounds like it was a very significant battle, and I'm sure that it was significant to those who fought the battle, and certainly to those who were killed and wounded and their families. So I think it's important to continue this research. You mentioned throughout our visit today several North Carolina connections, whether it was generals or troops. What were some of those other connections to North Carolina?
Okay, right. So, I'll quickly skip over some of these. North Carolina very much front and central to their understanding the battle. In the much misunderstood Confederate assaults on Humphreys' Second Corps line on day 1, late on day 1, the Tar Heel brigades of William McRae and John Cook featured prominently in the attacks east of Rocky Branch. And a key point that many accounts get wrong is that William McRae wasn't even at the battle. He was on leave, another one vastly experienced who wasn't there. Now, both these Tar Heel brigades were badly let down by the tepid attack of John Gordon's men west of the stream. So this enabled the Federals time to focus their firepower on the Tar Heels, and they certainly suffered major casualties as a consequence. So I've mentioned how 14 medals of honor were awarded at this battle. None are memorialized on the battlefield, I hasten to add. Now, one of these medals of honor was awarded at the time to a Union cavalryman for capturing the flag of the 33rd North Carolina Infantry in the fighting along Vaughan Road, which we've talked about. The counts in the official records and elsewhere features prominently. The one drawback is that North Carolina regiment wasn't at the battle. So I wrote a magazine article on the mystery of this, and my colleagues and I even managed to track down the remnants of the actual flag. And experts naturally suggested that it was probably a typo in the official records, and it was actually the remains of the 23rd North Carolina infantry. and they were in Robert Johnson's brigade, and which then fit the prevailing battle narrative of Johnson fighting along Vaughan Road, where the flag was captured. Unfortunately, evidence I came up with and other evidence has shown conclusively that Johnson, again, he wasn't at the battle either. There's more experience missing. And his brigade, commanded by John Gimlet Lee, as we've talked about, he wasn't fighting along Vaughan Road. He was a mile away at Dabney's Mill. So the mystery still continues. So if any of your colleagues can offer any assistance in that, that would be greatly welcomed.
Certainly, certainly. We'll see if anybody knows about that.
And so that brings me to John Gimlet Lee himself. He's the guy who fought bravely and tenaciously at the afternoon of February the 6th, sorry, around Dabney's Mill. And they were the only force protecting Lee's entire right of Petersburg, and effectively held the survival of Richmond in his hands, where they were faced by 5 Union brigades. Now, Gimlet Lee is quite a colourful character, and I don't have time to go into stories about him, but it's good to check out. But suffice to say that one of his best friends before, during, and after the war was George Armstrong Custer. So that's an interesting point. So another interesting North Carolina issue is quite where the Confederate cavalry were in this battle has foxed many accounts. Rooney's Lee's cavalry division was based at Belfield. We know where that was in the earlier map, 40 miles further south. And Rooney Lee and General Lee, his dad, had called him up on the 5th, and it was allegedly they all arrived overnight. So, but I've worked with quite a few people, including Butch Barringer, one of Rufus Barringer's descendants. Rufus Barringer's North Carolina Brigade, they was one of the brigades in Rooney Lee's division. It seemed that only Richard Beale's Virginia Brigade made the journey. The other 2 brigades were either unwilling or unable to attend. And finally, I'd like to pay tribute to North Carolina historian Lee W. Sherrill from High Point, North Carolina. And he sadly died in 2017 before my research began. He wrote a detailed book about the 21st North Carolina Infantry in 2015. And he certainly did a very thorough job with his research. And despite that regiment being one of the famed for fighting from Manassas to Appomattox, Sherrill devoted a large chapter to the Hatcher's Run battle. That in itself is pretty unusual, because authors and certainly publishers don't like to waste space on things that people don't have any interest in. So, but he did, and he found a lot of new information that certainly ran contrary to the convention about the battle. He was the one who found Gimlet Lee's report in the official record supplements, for example. Now, he wasn't writing about a book about Hatcher's Run, so he probably didn't understand the importance of what he'd found. But Petersburg experts never really picked up on his account, and they tend to had stuck to their traditional but flawed story. Unfortunately, Sherrill's account suffered from a lack of maps, which again, paper books, that they don't have the space for that. They use them sparingly. So consequently, some of his geography was a bit muddled up. But his book is a constant companion to me and certainly helped propel me on my Hatcher's Run quest.
Well, we're certainly grateful for all the work that you've done. We're kind of coming to the end of our visit here.
Yeah.
But it's really been enlightening and eye-opening, especially for, I'm sure, a lot of people who are not as familiar with the battle. And we here at the Cape Fear Civil War Roundtable are grateful that we can help get some of that information out there, make it a little bit more prominent. And so we certainly thank you so much for sharing not only your knowledge, but your passion about the American Civil War and the Battle of Hatcher's Run.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yes, for all your insightful contributions that you've made to our Roundtable Facebook page,
Mm.
which kind of brings me to let everyone know if anyone is interested in more information, you can certainly check out Dr. Lambert's many contributions on our Facebook page, the Cape Fear Civil War Roundtable. Lots of interesting information. We're also going to post links to Dr. Lambert's ebook on the Hatcher's Run, the battle, and then the several articles that he's also written, and try to get some of that information out there. We are we are so very grateful that you were able to spend some time with us and to share your knowledge and, like I said, your passion. We need more of that, and we're certainly grateful that you're bringing this information about the little known battle to light.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thanks for inviting me. And yeah, it's very much all about raising awareness of this battle and the people who fought there, for sure.
Certainly.
Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much. And
Yeah,
we hope to continue seeing more information from you in the future.
yeah, I'd love to come back.
If you're ever wanting to come to the Wilmington area, let us
Yeah.
know, and we'll give you a nice tour of the Fort Fisher and the Wilmington campaign.
Right. Well, I might take you up on that offer.
All right, sounds
Thank,
good.
yeah,
Thank you
okay.
so much.
Cheers, Chris.
Thank you.